she's gonna be speaking through this computer too.
So is this volume audible for everyone?
It's audible for me.
Hello? Okay, so my pronounces are she, her. My pronunciations are she, her, and I take my POIs verbally. So my speech would start in three, two, one. So the current industry, whether so every single industry, whether it's eco-friendly or not, has contributed to harming the earth in some way. Over 130 countries, more than half of the world, agree that carbon pricing is beneficial. Yet only 40 countries have actually implemented it, and even then, it's only applied to a few industries. To truly lower global emissions, we should mandate carbon pricing across all industries instead of making it optional. Currently, companies exploit different carbon taxes by operating in countries with little or no carbon pricing, allow them to continue polluting without consequences. This undermines global efforts to reduce emissions. Our goal in this debate is to significantly reduce carbon emissions and encourage companies to invest in their greener production methods. Before we go any further, I'd like to define some definitions. Firstly, is carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is a financial charge or cost applied to carbon emissions, either through a direct tax on carbon or through a market-based system like cap and trade. And secondly, its mandate is to require by law, meaning all industries must comply without exceptions. Now to the problem identification. Firstly, we have uncontrolled carbon emissions. Firstly, plant factories elsewhere, which means that there will be less or no carbon pricing. For example, there are two factories that we have here. One which charges carbon pricing at a very high price, and the other charges carbon pricing at a low price. So will most factories be located for large and big successful countries? So obviously the cheaper one. So these companies will only build factories in areas that have low or no carbon prices, so they can continue emitting. Secondly, carbon pricing currently is being placed at a very low price, so every company can afford it, making them continue to emit. Now to our stakeholders. Firstly, other citizens. So citizens are increasingly aware of the adverse effects of climate change, including extreme weather events, rising sea areas, and health risks due to pollutions. And they're also supportive of environmental action, but also sensitive to how policies impact their daily lives, particularly on their economic situation. And now to the companies. So the companies usually sell products and services for profit and influence in the market. However, some companies, particularly who thus are already investing in sustainability, might support it as a way to level the playing field. And finally, is the government. So the government is tasked with implementing policies that effectively reduce carbon emissions while maintaining economic stability, and they're the key decision maker in implementing and enforcing carbon pricing. Now you see, both teams we both have a burden of proof. So first of all, let us say that both sides need to agree on one thing, that carbon pricing is good. And our burden of proof here is to look at whether mandating carbon pricing is good or bad. Now, firstly, panels, take a look at the current economy and how badly the environment problems are taking over the world. Since 1990, the economy has started rising. Over the years, CO2 has terribly affected the world as a whole. The World Economic Forum has stated the world is producing over 34 billion tons of CO2 each year. Panels, if this continues as a future problem, you should take a look whether on where which is the best world for all citizens as a whole. How does our carbon pricing work? Premise will be so we would implement carbon tax and cap and trade globally, and we would implement slowly. For example, the carbon limit or cap will be set by the government high, and the price to pay if you exceed that will be low for companies to adapt. Over time, we will lower the cap to appropriate levels for the tax. Exceeding the limit will be high to discourage companies for exceeding the limit, and exceeding the limit too much, the price you have to pay will significantly escalate, like increasing how much you have to pay for per kilo of CO2. CO2. The limit will reset each year. Our policy will also allow companies to trade their permits, which allows them to emit more in the form of auctions. This will help smaller companies to develop larger companies to be able to continue developing. This limit will also decrease extremely slowly every once in a while. Now, I would like to move on to my arguments. Firstly, mandating carbon pricing across all industries ensure that no sector is unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged. In the fight against climate change, it's crucial that all industries help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Almost every company is contributing to this problem, and if we continue to this path, the buildup of carbon dioxide will become irreversible, as many scientists warned. So, how do we ensure companies reduce their emissions fairly? The solution is carbon pricing. Each company would be assigned with a specific amount of CO2 that they can emit, and they would pay the carbon tax if they exceed this limit. This approach ensures fairness while addressing the problem. By applying carbon pricing universally, all industries bear the cost of their carbon emissions, ensuring that no single industry is unfairly penalized or given a cost advantage. This maintains healthy competition across the economy. And the climate change is a global issue that requires contributions from all sectors of the economy. If only a few industries are targeted, it places an undue burden on them while allowing others to continue polluting without consequences. So, mandating carbon pricing across all industries ensures that every sector contributes its fair and national and global climate goals by making sure that their emissions will be limited. And no matter what, everyone will emit the same, but some just give the permit to others because they don't have to emit this that much. This collective responsibility makes it more likely that emissions target will be met, and that the transition to a low carbon economy will be successful. Now to my second argument, which is and cap and trade allows the industries to make money and to develop small businesses more. Small industries will have a lot of spare limits, so they can sell it to larger industries to allow small businesses to develop. Since these small businesses won't emit much, all businesses in the world won't emit more. Just the permit is being given to others. Many small businesses are growing allows more a diverse market and much faster developing economy. If the carbon tax is implemented, companies won't just put their prices up and expect it to be a long-term solution. They will have to actively find ways to switch to green technology to adapt so that they can still make profit because that's their goal. If they can adapt quickly enough, they will lose customers as other companies who are able to adapt will take over their place. The race for green technology, once a carbon tax is implemented, will also create competition, and competition which generates development and progress. And for all the reasons above, I rest my case here.
Thank you so much, first speaker. Now let's move on to the first speaker of opposition. Here. First speaker of opposition.
Yes, hi. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Hold on, let me just set up my timer. Alright. Alright. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proposition severs the dialysis for all vulnerable nations at the highest degree. Asking the US to go green is basically asking a rich person to pay for a luxury car when they clearly can't afford to. Asking Vietnam to go green is basically asking a poor person to pay for steak and wine when all he has left are pennies and paper clips. Three things I'm going to do in my speech. The first one, some responses to their case, and second, some setup on two layers, the relevance of a developing nation to this debate and why it's important. The second thing, why carbon tax won't necessarily work for developing nations. And the third, an argument on why pollution is the very important prerequisite for opting to green technology in the first place. So then some responses to that. The first thing that Prop says is that their burden is to prove how they reduce carbon through cap and trade. They said that carbon pricing status quo is cheap and no one takes them. Our bottom line point here is that their bottom line point here is that carbon pricing is good. Our bottom line is whether or not mandating it is good or bad. Environmental problems take over the world. Firstly, we would like to differ. The burden of proof here is on whether all industries like adhere to this. And then the second thing is, but even if we buy their burden, right, they don't necessarily explain to you how cap and trade works. But why is it that it won't work? We tell you this through a few mechanisms. No one will opt in the way cap and trade works is literally the literal reason why countries come together to sign a contract is so that they can sell carbon in the green market. The prices will still increase regardless whether or not you have cap and trade in place. The second thing here is that carbon pricing throughout all industries, all sectors are not disadvantaged. It's contingent on all countries agreeing. That means is that if some countries don't agree, this mechanism doesn't necessarily work. And then the third thing, cap and trade. Let's say like they say cap and trade like lets small business develop more. They say there's spare limits, we can sell it. They have spare credits, they can sell it to larger industries like tax and competition. But we tell you that this won't work on two fronts, right? The first one is because most of the countries that actually pollute are developing nations. They pollute solely because they are the ones that have no means nor the capacity to turn green. We tell you that companies in bigger countries, especially those like China and USA, already have the incentive to turn green, and that is why the cap and trade mechanism likely isn't feasible for them. Then the second thing is we then flip this and say that because of the fact that bigger companies in developed countries have the means and the capacity to do so, exploitation is likely to occur because these big companies end up selling the cap to smaller countries, and this harms them directly. Okay, then I'm going on to set up now. What is the weight of a developing nation, right? So the first thing here is that when we talk about developing nations, they look like comparatively poorer countries. They probably lack development in certain areas, right? i.e. they lack healthcare, they lack industrialization. They generally have limited capital and revenue, barely enough for the people on the ground. But having said that, right, we believe that these developing nations have a principal right to pollute as much as they can in order to develop, at least to the extent of them being developed enough to be able to opt into greener alternatives. The reasons here are twofold. The first one, these countries have probably been exploited by developed nations. They have literally been put into the situation that they are in because they were exploited by developed nations, i.e. African countries being exploited by European powers for their resources. The second thing here is that the problem of climate change stems from the industrialization period about a century ago. It is specifically the buildup of these industries that led to these carbon emissions in the first place. But then why is it that carbon tax specifically does not run for these industries then? Well, I want to note here, countries like China and USA have the capacity to go green / suffer the carbon tax imposed because they are developed nations, because they already have functioning and rich economies that they can work their way around. But the second thing here is that, but here's where you draw the comparative, right? Countries like Vietnam or Uganda, like developing countries, they lag very far behind in terms of economic and development and like all those things because of the previous era of colonization and exploitation. Because of this, they literally need every check of cash they can put into their hands in order to catch up with developed nations. So I think therefore, the debate lies in the simple weighing of impact. The debate should not be about whether or not developed nations can pay this tax, but rather whether or not these minority nations can survive with the carbon tax imposed on them. But then even when they want to argue on the premise of developed countries, we can take them at their best and prove why there are incentives for those developed countries to opt into greener alternatives without the carbon tax. Here are some incentives, right? The first thing is the first mover advantage. Corporations in wealthy nations have the incentive to monopolize in green technology as a way to promote their environmentally friendly products to their customers, i.e. China making the first electric car and using that as a promotion advantage. And the second thing, right, public backlash. We think that especially in Western liberal democracies, public backlash and social movements are a mechanism to pressure countries to stop carbon emissions, i.e. the call for China to stop polluting and social movements are a mechanism to pressure countries to stop carbon emissions and like calling China to stop polluting and industrializing. Then thirdly, right, fossil fuels. I think like a lot of these nations rely on fossil fuels, but the fact that fossil fuels are non-renewable, right, meaning down the line they are going to have to exhaust their energy source and have to rely on renewable and green energy, and therefore they need to develop this sector. So then moving on to the argument, right. I think the argument here is, and this is also our counterfactual, pollution is the prerequisite to opting into greener alternatives. So then if we look at the premise, I think here we had to look at real world examples like China and the US. The reason why these nations are so successful in the first place is because they have had the chance to industrialize and develop their economies before they spend money on developing green technology. Why this premise is true, I'll give you a few structural reasons as to why. The first one is firstly to understand how industrialization brings money to these countries in the first place, because they probably look like booming industries that copy paste factories to output consumer goods. For example, a factory producing fertilizer for the agricultural sector in India, for example. Then, especially for like developing nations, this process is like I highlight this process as a very significant and very important process because of two reasons. The first one is that when you allow more companies to start up, like you allow foreign investors to come into a developing country, it's simple. The impact here is that you open job opportunities to support people financially, and you give people jobs and you give them money. But then the second thing is, I think that has a few second-term impacts, right? Things like education and more foreign investment likely to follow suit if a country is already in the process of getting rich. I.e., foreign investors trust your country more, thus they invest more into your country. All right, I think I'm going to go on to some comparatives here. The first is that we think that implementation of carbon tax is detrimental to the process of industrialization. When you impose carbon tax, it comes with a lot of lengthy bureaucracy and financial debt that these developing nations so desperately like cannot pay for in the first place. But then given our counterfactual, right, we think that these developing nations would eventually get enough money once they industrialize, and then after that, only then they will be able to develop green alternatives. So then some like short impacts on longevity then. I think firstly, when you enable developing countries to develop like running and functioning systems, like for example, running economies and markets, we think that these structures will probably exist in future generations as well. Therefore, we think intuitively this has two main impacts. So I think the first one is that we are able to generate money in the long run. That is to say that we generate for more than just developing green technology. Developing nations are going to be able to develop past the motive of developing green technology. That is to say that you can like establish education, you can establish like hospitals, medical facilities, all that stuff, and probably lead against other nations in aspects like innovation, for example. So that also means that things like systemic things within developing countries can be tackled. So for example, like with more education, it comes more awareness for like against racism and more awareness for rights, etc. So then we think the comparative here is simple. Longevity is able to be sustained further on our side because we give them as much money as they need in order to develop. The reason for this is because as in our framing framed earlier, we tell that developing nations need this kind of money in order to actually industrialize, in order to actually industrialize and then develop their own markets and economies in order to get the money to develop greener alternatives. So as long as PROP doesn't tackle why developing countries can survive without carbon tax, they lose this case entirely. Proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you so much for that fun speech. Now let's move on to the second speaker proposition. Here.
Yes. So let me have some time to reorganize my speech. Okay, so I will take my POIs verbally, just like my first speaker, and let me organize my speeches real quick. Okay, so my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, throughout this debate, I would like to prove to you why that our side is trying to make the world a better place, and why if you were to follow opposition's path, our world will be worse than what it already is. First of all, I would like to rebut to their current ideas. First, that you said that a cap and trade won't work because most countries that are developing countries, but they clearly didn't pay attention to our policy because the pollution are from large corporations in large countries, and these large corporations are polluting in the poorer countries, and our policy will tax the corporation itself and not the country that is emitting. So if a shoe factory that has headquarters in the US pollutes in a poor contributes to the carbon emissions in poor countries, the corporation is the one that has to be capped, be hit with a limit, and taxed if the limit is exceeded. And on their side also said that it will this was exploited by developed nations to produce. Well, our carbon tax won't target the country, but the industry or the corporation behind it itself. So if a large corporation build factories in developing countries and stuff, their headquarters in their home country will be the one to pay. And their side has no policy or whatsoever or anything to actually tackle the problem. So if we were just to follow their side, the world will be the same as currently, and it will only go worse. Throughout my speeches, I will prove to you why. First of all, I would like to move on to my arguments. First is the thing. If we make carbon pricing mandatory for all industries, it reduces a very big problem in our world right now, which is greenwashing, which is the practice where companies falsely advertise their products or operations as environmentally friendly and has become a significant issue in today's marketplace, not only in developing but also developed countries. Many companies present themselves as green to attract environmentally conscious customers, even if they're actually not green. However, by implementing a cap and trade system or any carbon pricing whatsoever, we can effectively eliminate greenwashing because the system enforces strict measurable limits on carbon emissions across all industries, ensuring that companies can't simply pretend to be eco-friendly. They have to be. So now implementing a carbon tax provides a valuable source of revenue that can be strategically used to address climate change and promote green technology. The funds and profits generated from taxing carbon emissions can be invested into renewable energy projects such as solar, wind power, or any other green energy, which are crucial for reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Additionally, the revenue can support energy efficient initiatives and enhance climate resilience and drive innovation to clean technologies, or support the countries that are suffering from this current tax by helping them develop their green technologies. By funding research and development, providing for green technologies and supporting sustainable practices, a carbon tax revenue helps accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy while reducing the financial impact. A larger and more a third argument is that we're going to have a larger and more prospering market, as our first speaker said, with the development of many small businesses by selling off their permits if they don't need or they don't emit enough. They don't need to emit that much. They can sell to other large businesses and allow smaller businesses to actually develop and this makes a very large and competitive market. Despite being hated by some, competition is what truly allows the world as we know it to develop and progress to happen, which means in our world, we will not only have a large and diverse market of products, but we will also develop faster thanks to competition and allowing products to be higher in quality and also eco-friendly. Now, another thing is that it deals with climate change faster than the opposition side. Instead of letting companies to whether choose if they were going to pay for their emissions or not, forcing them makes them think of long-term solutions as soon as possible. Since these large corporations, they knew they're going to get taxed. And as our policy said, we're going to tax them at a low rate before they're increasing, allowing them time to adapt. That the time they can use to invent green technology for them to actually make a sustainable pathway for their future. And this will help the world to transfer into a low carbon or green energy society quicker. In a time of a crisis like this, there must be some sacrifice that we should make, and this small sacrifice will ensure the survival and progress of humanity as a whole in the long term. While opposition slows down the solving of this global crisis. In our world, we have made many major movements that sacrifice parts of our well-being or industries for our long-term survival and development, like during the massive ozone hole when it was discovered in the late 20th century. All countries have agreed to ban the chemical that damaged the ozone layer, and many companies have to make a huge transition to replace this chemical with more ozone-friendly chemicals, and this allowed the ozone layer to recover back. If our world has already saved itself and cooperate to shift how our society operates for the sake of the planet once, we can surely affirm that we can actually do this again. Now, moving on to more or potential rebuttals. Well, they might say that, well, the price will be extremely expensive if we implement this carbon tax. But our side already said that we would implement this slowly, and the price will increase slowly over time until it reaches the amount that can effectively work out, allowing companies to actually adapt to it, since raising the prices of something isn't a long-term solution for any company whatsoever. And also, your side also said that, well, the poor might have to spend more on basic needs. The rich will also have to spend more. Plus, our side puts a limit, which means they won't spend more, but they will have to find ways to adapt. And since companies will also actively adapt, the prices of basic living needs and services will barely change, and they would also in the end be more green. And poor countries like Vietnam had already found ways to utilize green energy as a second world country, and in many other third world countries that already use green energy as a part of their energy source, and they're still efficient. Their only struggle are having to battery to store it or anything that helps them develop. Still, energy for countries that are both green yet they're poor have been observed in a lot of countries like Burkina Faso, Kenya, and the Philippines. Now, moving on, I would like to compare our two sides of the house. On our side, consumers are going to be as satisfied with our policy as ensures the price will increase by very little or not at all to prevent mass rates of inflation or price change. While your side made it worse for consumers since they will either buy the products that to support the non-green companies, which will promote them to continue emitting, or they have to pay a lot more for green companies because they're suffering from the carbon tax. We also help small businesses to grow while large businesses continue to develop as they find ways is to innovate and find more ways to utilize green technology in their work. While your side only supports the businesses that are large by saving their money, and your side will also drive away customers from green companies as their products are still being carbon taxed, making them more expensive and making being green hard in the long run, and making lots of companies unable to transit to green. Well, the worst case on our side is the economy won't adapt fast enough, causing temporary inflation. But as our side already implemented an amazing policy, a policy that will help with this, is it will only last for a very short amount of time. After that, corporations will find more low carbon methods to operate and reintegrate into this new society. Our side also removes greenwashing, low carbon economy, and the best case for their side, the world will stay the same now and will only go down as corporations will keep emitting without being stopped. And there will, and I rest my case here.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now let's move on to the second speaker of opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, great, thanks. I prefer my POIs verbally. I won't be looking at the chat. Great. The world that proposition needs to defend was a world where every single industry, including the small ones, had to pay for this carbon pricing, has to be impacted. Judge, note here that the entire case only works if every single company, whether large or small, is impacted to a severe extent. So that is to say that proposition's entire case as to how they're going to co-opt our benefits and tell you how these small industries won't be benefited cannot work. But three things I'll do in my speech today. Number one, I'm going to call out their mechanization and tell you why it doesn't work. Number two, I'm going to give you a few direct responses as to why I don't buy any of their argumentation at all. And number three, I'm going to give you an extension to my LO, and lastly, I'll tell you why cap and trade will lead to exploitation. Firstly, then, on how their mechanization does not work. They tell you that they need to tell you how cap and trade actually works and why these countries will opt into it. We tell you very clearly, right, that these countries they can only implement this cap and trade if that certain country does so agree to do so. And we tell you very, very clearly from first already that the countries that end up polluting the most are likely going to be smaller and poorer countries that don't have the capacity and don't have the means to opt into green technology, to opt into sustainable mechanization. So that is to say that countries that are small and poor and cannot afford carbon tax and cannot afford to buy these sort of things like solar panels and wind turbines, they're likely not going to opt into signing this treaty, because note that is how it works, right? Cap and trade cannot work just because you force it on them alone. It only works if you give them the incentive to try, if you give them the incentive to opt into it. And if they know that they're going to be harmed because of the fact that you're going to tax them, they're likely not going to, and therefore all of your benefits cannot manifest. A few responses then. Number one, as to how like their greenwashing argument just does not work. They tell you that greenwashing exists and that this will lead people to believe that these companies are sustainable when it really does not. Note they don't give any comparative to this, right? They tell you that, oh yeah, greenwashing exists, but they don't tell you why this is important, and they don't tell you what is the impact of greenwashing in the first place. Understand then that companies can still claim to be sustainable even if they are not on your side of the house. If you charge them tax and you charge them carbon cap, and they choose to say, oh yeah, actually we don't emit carbon because of the fact that the money that they pay is going to offset the carbon that they emit, greenwashing is still going to exist on your side of the house. You're not able to mitigate this harm at all. Like the second thing then is they tell you that the price will be extremely like they try to preempt our case and tell you that, oh, actually the prices are not going to increase because we tax them very little. Two broad call outs to this. Number one is that if the prices were so little and the tax does not impact them to the point where you have to charge higher prices, then your entire case just does not work. Note that your case only works if you give the people a big enough incentive to want to change, a big enough incentive to want to actually opt into carbon, like into like green technology and stuff like that, right? Insofar as you don't prove that's how you give them the incentive to do so, because you try to softline your entire case and tell us, oh, actually we're only going to charge a little bit by a little bit. It doesn't work, because if you truly do only charge them a little bit, then there's no impact on your side of the house. There is no delta. You cannot co-opt any of our benefits. But before I go on, I'll take a point. 3, 2, 1. I'll assume that's none. So two things that our opposition needs to prove to you today in order to win the debate. Number one is we're going to tell you why these big developed nations already have the incentive to go green anyways, and that is why we don't need this carbon tax and this carbon cap and trade. Number two, we're going to tell you as to why these developing nations need to pollute first in order to go green later. I'll deal with this first. Let's take an example of China, right? Note how they were like one of the biggest carbon emitters, like in the very beginning, and only now they're opting into green technology. The reason why this is so is because countries, especially like these small countries, they need to pollute first, they need to urbanize, and they need to develop to actually have the means to pay for things like solar panels and wind turbines. Understand that you cannot force a small and poor country with barely any resources and like a very, very slim profit margin to want to opt into this green technology anyways, if they already know that it is a very big investment. Yeah, sure, the USA and China can do that, but it's because they're already big, they're already rich, and they already have the incentive to do so. I'll prove to you why they have the incentive later, and that is where opposition will take the debate. Like, if they need to prove to you how their side of the house is going to impact these companies so large to the point that they're going to immediately opt into green technology, to the point that they're going to like abandon carbon in general and just go into green technology, right? Understand then they will tell you very clearly from first that this incentive to go green exists owing to the fact that first mover advantage exists. So what does this first mover advantage look like? Two things. Number one, it looks like big countries like the USA and China wanting to opt into green technology first because they want to build a reputation. They want to look like they have the best like form of green technology, right? This means that after these poor countries develop and they have the means to buy these sort of green technology things, then they will opt into that certain country, right? So this means that if USA chooses to invest in like no fuel cars right now, electric cars right now, in the long run, in 10 years time, when Vietnam gets rich, or like when a small country gets rich, they're going to opt into like the USA's electric cars as opposed to other cars. So this means they were able to prove to you how the incentive for them to want to opt into green technology already exists, because they want that first mover advantage. They want to be the first ones, and that is why big countries, big developed nations like USA, Canada, France, and China, etc., they already have the incentive to want to go big because of the fact that they know that they need to do so in the first place, right? So this means we're able to offset any of their claims as to why they have to be taxed, because they already have the incentive to do so. The second burden that proposition needed to prove to you then was as to how these taxes is not going to negatively impact these developing nations, right? I'll move into this then. So why do these developing nations need to develop first? We tell you very clearly already. The developing nations, when they don't have the means to opt into green technology, they cannot do any of the things that you want them to do. So also note that your alternative on cap and trade won't work for them, because they don't have the incentive to opt into it in the first place, because they simply think that they'll just continue to make money from manufacturing, and they're not going to opt into it because it's going to harm them explicitly. But before it hits 7, proposition, I urge you to give me a point. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Moving on. So what is the delta on opposition then, and how do we tackle this issue directly? We tackle this issue directly in two fronts. Number one is that we actually target the ones that are polluting, which is to say the small and developing nations who have to opt into fossil fuels, who have to use these sort of unrenewable energy sources because those are the only energy sources that they have. We target them first, we let them pollute, we let them develop first, so that in the long term, in like a few years time, they're able to have the money, they have the means, and they have the capacity to actually opt into green technology, to actually do those sort of things that you want them to do so, right? The second thing the opposition managed to prove to you here was as to how the incentive to go green already exists in status quo for these big developing nations, in a sense that first mover advantage exists and these big countries want to do so, which means that all your claims on how these people don't want to opt into it doesn't stand. Lastly, then I'll tell you why cap and trade ends up leading to exploitation and why this is bad on your side of the house, even if developing nations choose to opt into it. So even if we buy their mechanization and we assume that cap and trade will, these countries will opt into cap and trade, it is still not good for small businesses, right? We flip their entire argumentation and we tell you that in reality, what's likely going to happen is that big countries that already have the incentive, they already have green technology and have the means to buy those sort of technology, is going to exploit these small industries, and they're going to end up doing things like charging at a high price and exploiting them, right? Also note that if their entire stance on how pollution from large corporations are is going to exploit the large corporation in of itself, it means that these corporations in smaller countries, they're going to get shut down, and these big corporations don't want to invest in them anymore, and that means that all of your benefits cannot manifest because you harm these developing countries in of itself. So proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now moving on to third speaker proposition. Here.
Okay, so my third speaker of the team is here, and she will start her speech when she says she will start her speech.
So again, is this volume available for everyone?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, so my speech would start in 3, 2, 1. So in this debate, we have so in my speech, I will have the clashes, the rebuts, and finally compare the two worlds. Firstly, are the clashes in this debate that we had won over. So firstly, is mandating the carbon pricing is good or bad? So the proposition triumphs in this battle by arguing that carbon pricing is beneficial for the sustainable economic growth of any country, being the long-term cause and short-term gains. Our side also reveals that the revenue recycling and increasing the implementation rate of reforms may help to avoid potential problems and make the observed negative effects non-critical and eventually positive. And the equity of the world, which is the proposite. Our side should also win in this clash, therefore thereby showing that fairness is a part of the carbon pricing model. On the issue of fairness, the proposition side has demonstrated that carbon pricing will not only be fair in the sense that all sectors will contribute, but also capable of furthering social equity. And finally is the policy of our side. Our side wins because it argues that stability is what makes sensible policy work. Not only because we have equity for everyone in all industries, we also have equity, and it will not be as bad as your side. Making carbon pricing mandatory for all industries also guarantees that there are no contradictions in the rules and will be present, leaving the business world with an obvious path to follow and invest on. The opposition side here is by pointing out that our side will create an environment that is quite unstable, and solving the actual climate change issues. So opposition So opposition doesn't make any solution. So even if our side works out terribly, it will still be to it will still be able to contribute and solve a part of this problem. We would rather have something than nothing. Now to the rebuttals. So firstly, poor countries can't afford carbon pricing, as the speaker stated. So we have already rebutted this already. We said that the corporations are getting taxes and not the country. And she also stated that greenwashing is irrelevant. Well, greenwashing makes people support corporations that are actually secretly polluting, so they won't change. People have no motivation. Well, here our stated quo has stated that customers will support green and eco-friendly eco-friendly companies. Since you didn't challenge our status quo, both sides have agreed on the customer support companies that are green making this rebuttal irrelevant. So we charge too little. This is misunderstanding from the other side, because we said that the price will be small for companies to adapt, and then we will increase it eventually, and the countries will eventually develop and switch green. Too slow. Well, this is actually too slow, because our side will solve the issue faster, because your side has to wait for all countries to develop, and countries don't just develop overnight. And by the time all your countries have developed, climate change would already gone worse, and it takes away lots of money and effort to undo. We tackled the climate change as soon as possible and not just wait it out. And finally are the comparisons. So firstly, the worst case for our side which is the economy won't adapt fast enough, causing a temporary inflation and cost increases that will last for that would last only for less than a year. After that, corporations will find a more low carbon method to operate and reintegrate into the new low carbon society with cap and trade system. And it's the long term for our side. Well, firstly, it's greenwashing gone. Secondly, it's more a low carbon economy. Thirdly, small business develop. Fourth, a new trading market for carbon limits, which means new ways of making money. Fifth, more money to fight climate change. And finally, and the best case for our side here is the world will just stay the same as now, and it will only continue to go down as the corporations keep emitting without being stopped. And there will be less money to actually fight climate change, and greenwashing will still be a thing. And for even both of our sides of the work still works out, our side will still even have peace. Firstly, consumers are going to be satisfied by our policy limits inflation, while your side made a worse world for consumers. Since they will either buy the product that they support or the non-green companies because they are cheap, and they will pay significantly more for any green companies because they have to pay with the carbon tax. We also help small businesses to grow more than yours, while large businesses continue to develop as they find ways to produce CO2 less by investing more low carbon ways to produce items. While your side will drive away customers from green companies as their products are still being run on carbon tax and more expensive, making being green is still hard on the long run. And finally, why our long term and short term will benefit more. So requiring carbon pricing provides a certainty to which companies can model their future management of emissions, their investments in emissions. Such long-term predictability is necessary for a transaction in low-carbon future, given the fact that it is long-term, complex, and full of uncertainties. And this is why our team is better, because the ideas behind a proposition are much more better, because they provide a long-term commitment and still sustainability, which is so crucial for the business and the economy in the low-carbon transaction. And for all the reasons above, I rest my case here.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now let's move on to the third speaker of opposition. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I will start. Okay, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, Gov dumped their pre-prepared case with zero engagement on our case. My speech today will be extremely simple. 2 responses on corporations versus governments, and then after that, carbon tax revenue. Then after that, a clash on the environment. Now, we did not tell you anything about carbon tax. We told you when these countries develop, they are actually able to opt into greener alternatives because they now have the capital. That is the fundamental flaw government do not accept from our case, thus they did not engage on that level at all. Now, first response on how corporations are taxed, not countries. We tell you that corporations contribute to local economies. The less they profit, the less the nation grows. It's very simple economics that government cannot understand. Next, on how carbon tax revenue can be used to fund green initiatives. Now, let's be charitable here and assume everyone opts in. Sure, MNCs could afford that, but in the process, you drive out every other small company from a poor nation. These taxes are simply too much for them to keep up because it is international taxation scores that you are putting on them. Eventually, taxes will fade either from MNCs pivoting out or from startups filing bankruptcy. Now, why do we not accept this trade-off? It is because the environment is something of global importance. You need everyone to play a role from every single country for it to work. If nations simply cannot keep up, they will fall behind and either resort to dirty methods or to simply ditch this entire idea of green adoption. The case is simple. We tell you that if these people are not able to keep up with the high cost of green adoption, they will simply revert back to their dirty methods. This is something government have failed to identify, have failed to address in their case. Now, one clash on the environment here. Government tell you a very simple thing. They try to push this idea of cap and trade. However, one crucial part that they miss out in today's debate, we tell you that cap and trade must be an international agreement for an environmental pact between all countries. I'm unclear where your opt-in exactly comes from. Sure, such a policy needs signatures from all nations for jurisdiction to police these laws. Developing companies and countries would not opt in because your sole benefit of selling off carbon credits is not big enough of an incentive. PM told us that you sell excess carbon credits, however, we tell you it's not much money. Since no recognition came on this, we suppose that carbon credits are allocated according to the size and type of economy. Small companies from poor nations will not have much carbon credit to leverage because they are small and they do not need to produce as much carbon and will not get as much carbon credit. Developing countries make more money off cheap labor and factory manufacturing compared to selling off carbon credits. Even if we take you at your best, where all developed first world nations opt in, we tell you that companies, they are likely to move operations to nations without such carbon laws because these countries further do not have an incentive to opt into the cap and trade since they face an influx of manufacturing investment. Realize how, for example, Apple manufactures their phones in the US, for example. Then the US has such carbon laws, Apple is likely to move to a random country in Asia which does not have these carbon laws to start manufacturing there. You are not fixing the problem, you are driving people away. Because I tell you that insofar as the world cannot afford for such levels of adoption, people will just dodge the effect and will run away instead of trying to fix it because people want to profit, and if you can't allow them to profit, you are never going to solve this problem. Before I move on, any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Now, on opposition for environmental opposition, we explained since first how carbon emissions are prerequisite to cleaner methods. Government pushed their case from the perspective of first world nations trying to push their rich people ideals onto the poor. They do not understand the need people currently face in their growing economies. What these countries need now is a stronger economy. It is to produce more oil and gas because note one thing, the environment is not one of huge time sensitivity, but the crumbling economies and the starving people are. Sea levels will only rise to a certain level in the matter of decades. Opposition does not neglect the environment. We delay this to the point where these weaker nations are actually able to keep up. The green transition is expensive but requires huge national capital for it to work. You realize how, right? The biggest producer of EVs is China. It built its wealth on high pollution manufacturing. This is how people manage to reach the moral high ground to now bark on others to adopt these green policies. We tell you, government in this debate take a very privileged stance as these people from first world nations who assume that they are so rich so everybody else can afford this green transition too. Because you realize, right, when you are trying to adopt greener technologies like solar panels, for example, these things cost lots and lots of money. It does not work, and insofar as you cap the carbon emissions, people are going to evade these emissions instead of facing the music and trying to fix the problem. And this is something you have not proven to us in today's debate, and also lack engagement on anything we have been saying. Now, a few winning metrics here. Opposition pushes this gradual bottom-up change where nations have financial capital, then they will pivot. We tell you this is true for two reasons. Number one, because of international acceptance and the support of people in society who increasingly buy the green ideology. Because you realize people want to transition into green, but they're just unable to because they are poor. So when they no longer face this problem, they actually will change and want to change. And number two, we also tell you that the climate is something everyone suffers from and naturally want to fix. The only reason why they currently can't is because they are poor and need to develop. Now, before 7, any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Lack of engagement. Now, I think one last thing we need to solve in today's debate on longevity. Note that their side of the house will still take a substantial amount of time to go into green technology, i.e., even if government has tax money, they still need years to install solar panels and change everything to hydro-powered dams and everything else. The delta on opposition is twofold. Number one, how we give these countries the leverage we give these countries the opportunity to grow, and number two, we do not force these people into a chokehold where they are forced to adopt these policies now, and if they don't, they are forced out. Because you realize the exclusive harm that comes from government here. When you force people out, they are never going to change. Because when people no longer make money, when people suffer on the ground, because you realize here we are talking about developing countries who are not at the moral high ground of you to be able to talk to others about changing their policies, these people will pivot to ways where they're actually able to profit. Because that is when we take you at your best. But then we tell you here that opt-in is unlikely to happen because something I tell you from the start, which is very clear, is on how these nations, developing nations, are unlikely to opt in to this policy or coming from government because they know that they'll be making more money from cheap labor from high emission industries. Because you realize when Apple is no longer able to manufacture their iPhones in the US, they are likely to come to Asia or Africa with slightly more relaxed policies on carbon emissions. You are simply forcing people to run away, and that is for the MNCs. And those who are unable to run away, they simply shut down, they file bankruptcy, and they are never able to develop. And we tell you that when there is no development, there is no betterment in terms of the green sector. People will not be able to develop if they simply do not have the money. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now let's move on to the final speaker of opposition's case, the reply. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Indeed you are.
All right. What proposition needs to do in the debate was to actually bite the bullet and prove to you why they get benefits exclusively on their side. Insofar as the entire case hinges on the premise that they're going to softline the entire case, insofar as the entire case is based on the premise that everybody's going to agree to do the same thing, we think that the entire case falls. So proud to oppose. 3 key things I'll do my speech then. Firstly, on a few strategic callouts. Secondly, on the clash of longevity versus urgency coming out from proposition. And lastly, then, as to how we win on them on the 2 key metrics of the debate. firstly, there are a few call-outs. Number one is that you need to bite the bullet and understand that if you want to tax these people to the point that they have the incentive to go into green technology, you need to tax them a substantial amount to the point that it cuts into their profit. We tell you clearly from first, the main incentives of a company is to have profits, is to earn money, right? So note that if you don't cut into them, if you don't do what's the most proximate to them, you're likely not going to get any benefit on your side of the house. Second thing then is that you actually needed to prove your mechanization, right? You cannot say the word cap and trade, you cannot say the word carbon tax, and then run away and assume that you have made a coherent case, because you have not. Two things are responsible to the case, right? Number one is that they never engage with any of our points as to how cap and trade is likely to lead into exploitation, and therefore all the mechanization that they try to posit to you as to how this is going to cause these small businesses to develop is not going to in the first place. We tell you clearly already from the first three speeches that when these developing countries are the ones that pollute the most, it is likely that they are the ones that are most vulnerable to exploitation in terms of the cap and trade and the carbon limit that you set onto them, right? The second thing then is that on your entire taxing mechanism, right, is that you cannot tell us that, oh, we're going to tax them a little bit only and that's enough. Because if you really do tax them a little bit and it's not substantial enough to make them want to do anything about it, it means your entire mechanization won't work, right? And even if you do so get the money to build solar panels and whatever, understand that it's still going to take a substantial amount of time. I don't understand how a small country is going to be able to manifest an entire country full of hydropower dams, wind turbines in a span of 5 years, right? So that means we win on the clash of longevity because we tell you two key things, right? Number one is that when we let these developing countries develop themselves and let them pollute in order to achieve sustainability, that is good because we let them actually have the capacity to afford all these things. We don't push them into a corner where they're forced to do these things when they cannot, right? Note the outcomes on their side. That two things. Number one is that you're likely going to force these poor countries to stay poor and they have to continue to pollute on a much smaller scale. And number two is that companies in that specific country are just going to shut down. So that is to say, if you charge a H&M in Bangladesh and you say that, oh, we're going to charge you high amounts of taxes because you pollute a lot in that certain country, it means that H&M is not going to care about the carbon pollution. It means that they're likely to just take their factory away from Bangladesh because they know that they're going to lose a substantial amount of money, right? So that means all of your mechanization just cannot work insofar as you don't, number one, mechanize it to us, and number two, you don't actually prove anything. You just run away and assume that the word cap and trade means you have an actual case. Second thing then is as to why urgency does not matter in the debate and how they don't achieve it anyways on their side of the house. Urgency cannot be achieved on proposition insofar as you don't prove to us why the money that you get is going to be used immediately, and that in the span of 2 months, we're going to have a Malaysia, we're going to have a Vietnam and a Bangladesh that has immediately full hydropower dams, full solar turbines, and wind turbines, right? So that means that even if they want to claim that our side is going to take a substantial amount of time to develop, we say that it's a good thing because we actually give them the capacity, we actually let them go into it, we actually let them do something about it and develop. For example, China. We proved to you that China is an example of why countries, after they pollute, have the incentive to want to go into green technology and want to opt into it, which means that your entire case as to why these countries are just going to continue to pollute and be dirty just cannot stand, right? So two things we proved to you then on opposition. Number one is we proved to you why we win on the clash of longevity insofar as proposition didn't prove why they win on it, and insofar as their entire case hinges on an unanalyzed premise. Number two is we proved to you that they cannot achieve urgency on their side house. We proved to you that they're not able to help these developing nations at all, and we proved to you that they're going to harm them. They're not going to get any exclusive benefit at all. So proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now the final speaker of the House, I'd like to call upon proposition reply. Hear.
Okay, so I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition throughout this debate has been trying to point out all of our ideas with a huge misunderstanding of our entire debate. So let me just take you throughout this whole debate and prove to you why our team should win. Our team decided to take the desperate action and see climate change as a crisis that will affect all countries, including rich and poor. While opposition only cares about the poor countries, we care for everybody. And our global goal in this debate is to solve this crisis as fast as possible so that our globe can develop without the burden of climate change on their backs. We have a given policy. Unlike them, their side provides no policy to solve the issue whatsoever. So even if our policy doesn't work out very well, we would still somewhat have an impact on this global climate crisis and have time to find an optimal solution for our side. Well, and our side, something is still better than nothing. Their side does not make any solutions for the crisis. They neglect the well-being of all countries and only focus on a certain group. Our team has done better in showing in detail how our policy would work, and their side only scratched the surface of our policy and not trying to hit the benefits of the policy and telling you, panel, why the policy's harm will outweigh the benefits we mentioned. They didn't prove to their side why not doing anything would help the world more than actually doing something. Our stakeholders, which are customers and the people, are still being able to give in a better world than theirs, which is a world where they can afford goods at a reasonable price, and while society takes on a steady development streak to shift to a green and local urban society, well, and our side will also benefit all companies around the world, which is what they shouldn't try to argue about. Opposition does not go deep into any argument, and their side assume that our side is putting both two taxes, is carbon pricing and cap and trade at the same time. Their perspective of our policy is a misunderstanding, as their perspective of our policies is that the countries will have both have to pay for the carbon prices and have a limit. Well, our policy has clearly been that we're going to have a limit put onto a certain corporation, and then if you pass that, you'll start having to pay an escalating carbon tax. This understanding of the whole policy throughout this debate makes their entire arguments irrelevant throughout this debate. They try to also delay the issue. They try to delay making the issue worse because climate change doesn't just go away on its own. They only focus about what's going on in short term and what is going on with the current world right now, and they only care about the short term well-being of a certain group. Well, our side care about the long term for everybody. We also won over the economic clash, as the consumers are still going to have affordable products while being green at the same time. While opposition discourages the transition to green, as on their side of the house, being green means showing that you support the anti-carbon movement by paying the carbon tax while making their products more expensive, so they can't even help companies to transition to being green. And their lack of a solution to this entire situation and this global emergency right now shows that they only care about one aspect of this debate, while our side cares about everything in this debate. And with all that above, I am proud to propose. I rest my case.
Okay, thank you so much for that fine speech. I would like to congratulate both teams on making it to the final moment of the speeches. Please give me less than 10 minutes for conferral and deliberations, and I will get back